Hi everyone. We have actually arrived at the end of book one, A Bear Called Paddington, but not to worry, there's several more stories and adventures to come in a number of books in the series. Even Harley's excited about it, he can't wait. But I thought I'd actually share with you the postscript that appears at the end of book one, written by Michael Bond, the author himself, in 2001, when Michael Bond would have been 75, and more than 40 years after he wrote this book. Paddington was published, this first book was published in 1958, and I think that's significant for two reasons. For me, it's significant because it's the period after World War II, which ended in 1945, and there are these themes that come through in this book, and I wonder if you notice them as well, of lightheartedness, levity, a sort of a suspension of reality to try to find joy in what would have been the Depression years and undoubtedly fear and hardship. In fact, I think I read somewhere that Michael Bond wrote these stories based on a stuffed toy that he'd actually given his wife for Christmas one year, and the stories were an imaginative fiction about this bear coming to life and engaging in all these adventures to sort of cheer her up. Of course, the other major theme that resonates with me is acceptance, genuine acceptance of Paddington, who's travelled far in the search of safety. And in 1958, when this was published, we would have seen the enactment of the Refugee Convention, which was in 1951, which was an international treaty for the purpose of looking after those who were seeking asylum and fleeing persecution after the war. And I think throughout London, where Michael Bond and his wife lived, they would have seen, I've read, young Jewish children, orphans who had lost their parents during the war. And I think that level of acceptance and care that Paddington receives from the Brown family is perhaps one this world, even in 2023, can only aspire to. But I thought I'd leave you with this chapter list, this playlist, with the postscript written by Michael Bond. I found it really interesting. A Bear Called Paddington didn't begin life as a book. The opening paragraph was simply an early morning doodle, brought on by the certain knowledge that if I didn't put something down on the blank sheet of paper in my typewriter, nobody else would. However, it caught my fancy, so I wrote a second paragraph, then a third, until by the end of the day I had completed a whole story. The source of my inspiration was a toy bear sitting on the mantelpiece of our one-room flat near London's Portobello Market. I had bought it in desperation the previous Christmas Eve as a stocking filler for my wife, and we called him Paddington because I had always liked the sound of it, and names are important, particularly if you are a bear and don't have very much else in the world. In no time at all, he became part of the family. In fact, for a long time, he was the family and was treated as such, joining us at mealtimes, sharing our holidays, occasionally interrupting our conversations. 10 working days later, having completed 7 more stories, I realized I had a book on my hands. It hadn't been written with any particular age group in mind, which was fortunate because until then I had always written for adults. And if I had consciously aimed at a young audience, I might have written down, which is always a bad idea. Anyway, I agree with Gertrude Stein. A book is a book is a book, and it should be enjoyable on all levels. It was lucky, too, that I picked on a bear for my doodling. The late Peter Ball, actor and arctophile, which is a collector of teddy bears, by the way, actor and arctophile, once said that whereas dolls are always wondering what they're going to wear next, you never know quite what bears are thinking, and he was right. You feel you can trust them with your secrets, and they won't pass them on. Another thing about bears is that one perceives them in the wild lumbering around on 2 legs, so they're already halfway to being human. The first book in a series is always the most fun to write. The world is your oyster and you can go wherever your fancy takes you. However, at the same time, you build in certain parameters which are there for all time. Although Paddington's adventures take place in the present, I always picture him going home at the end of the day to the rather safe pre-war world which I remember from my childhood. I don't think they ever realised it, but my parents served as role models for Mr. and Mrs. Brown. There is also a lot of my father in Paddington, for he was very law-abiding and never went out without a hat in case he bumped into someone he knew and had nothing to raise. Jonathan and Judy were there to bridge the age gap. Mrs. Bird was based on memories of my childhood best friends Liv and Nanny. Paddington's best friend, Mr. Gruber, is important because he knows what it's like to be a refugee in a strange country, so they have a special relationship. The Browns' long-suffering next-door neighbour, Mr. Curry, triggers off many a story. I have only to put the two things together and things start to happen. Number 32 Windsor Gardens I saw as being just around the corner from our flat. Paddington was and always will be very real to me. He has his feet firmly on the ground and he has a very strong sense of right and wrong. So much so that when I come up against a problem in my own life, I often ask myself what he would do. The fact that others believe in him just as much is rewarding. For example, the boy who wrote saying he was so used to Paddington being the name of a bear, it now seemed a funny name for a station. And the nun who wrote to me out of the blue telling me she was in hospital, I suspect suffering from an incurable disease, and thanking me for all the comfort Paddington brought her. He couldn't have had a greater compliment paid him. Writing comedy is a serious business, a matter of distillation, of finding exactly the right word. On the whole, without the benefit of immediate audience response, one works in a kind of vacuum. However, I did once find myself sitting in a restaurant and overhearing two men in the next booth discussing Paddington's exploits. They were both laughing their heads off, and that was very satisfying because in the circumstances it was obviously genuine. I didn't let on I was there for fear of embarrassing both parties. Then, some years ago on a promotional tour in Australia, I had to carry a stuffed Paddington everywhere I went. Each time I boarded a plane, I knew it wouldn't be long before he would be asked up onto the flight deck. On one occasion, I left him up there, strapped into a spare bucket seat while the crew explained the controls. A little later on, I received a second message asking if I would mind him staying up there because he wanted to practice landing the plane. I didn't tell the other passengers. When I wrote the first book, I had no idea that he would eventually be honoured with a life-size bronze statue on the station itself. People use the plinth to sit on while they eat their sandwiches, which is rather apposite, really, and it's nice to think that they will probably still be doing it long after I have gone. I don't suppose we shall ever meet, but if we do, I shan't be at all surprised. Being a polite bear, I'm sure he will raise his hat, and as we go our separate ways, I shall regret not wearing one too, so that I could raise it in return as a mark of respect. That was Michael Bond, writing in April 2001. Stay tuned for the next book.